Good morning, and welcome to Christ Church of the Valley as we continue our series here in the book of Hebrews. I'm going to share with you this morning when I was studying the passages that we're going to look at this morning. I got to a place that I was absolutely overwhelmed. I got to a place where I said, I can't do it. I can't do it. And it's at that point that I've learned the best thing to do is to put it down, walk away, go do something else. Luckily, I have plenty of things to do, and to come back to it later. And the thing is, the author of Hebrews just gets into so much detail here this morning, and this analogy landed in my lap just this week, so I'm gonna show you like what I'm talking about this morning. So over here this morning, we had Robin playing on the piano, and you heard all of those notes, and with this hand, she's somewhere in the treble clef, and with this hand, she's somewhere in the bass clef. And with those two hands, for every chord, she's playing several notes. Several notes for all of those chords. And then over here, we had Allison on the guitar, and she's mostly up there in the treble clef, playing, once again, for every chord, she's playing at least 3 notes. Whereas I'm over here, and I'm on the bass, and I'm just in the bass clef. And this morning, specifically, all I did was play the root note. And so if the chord was C, all I played was a C. Whereas these two, they're over here playing A's and B's with that C, or B sharps or whatever. I'm not good at music theory, just keep that in mind. But they're playing all of these notes. I'm playing one note. They're playing all of these notes. I'm playing one note. And this morning, we could get into all of the details of the book of Hebrews, especially here. He's gotten into his argument. He's gotten into the details of his argument. But we will be here until dinner time if we get into all of the details. And that's dinner time tomorrow night, by the way. So what we're going to do is we're going to approach it from the base perspective. We're going to stay with his argument. We're going to stay with the flow of his argument, and we're not going to get into all of the details. And I apologize for that. If you were to spend the next 6 weeks studying in depth these passages, you would not have wasted a moment of time. I have to say that. How many of you know what a false dilemma is? A false dilemma is where there's a choice, but you haven't been given all of the options. Now, I'll give you a false dilemma. I realize the danger in this early in the sermon talking about lunch, but we're going to press forward anyways. If I was to say that you have 2 choices for lunch, you can go to a restaurant and eat lunch, or you can go home and eat lunch, that would be a false dilemma, right? Because there are several other options available for you for lunch, right? For example, perhaps you don't go home, perhaps you go to somebody else's house and have lunch with them. You didn't go home, right? Then again, we also have several stores in this town that have a deli. And in that deli, you could get some fried chicken and some mashed potatoes and stuff like that. And they have those little tables there. You didn't go to a restaurant. You didn't go home, but you still had lunch, right? So a false dilemma is where there's a choice, but you're not given all of the choices. Now, I'm going to be a little accusatory this morning, and I'm just going to say that 2 major movements in Christianity have put forward a false dilemma. They have said you can take the law, that is the law of Moses, so from Genesis to Deuteronomy, and you can keep it, or you can throw it away. And they've given you, those 2 are your only options. You can either keep the law, so we're going to keep Sabbath, and we're going to keep circumcision, and we're going to keep kosher, and we're going to keep all of those established by God, given by God to honor God, or you can throw them all away and be displeasing to God. And those are the 2 options that these particular churches have put forward to you. I believe there's another option, because the author of Hebrews here seems to suggest that there's a third option. And we're going to get into that third option. I'm going to begin in our last chapter, chapter 8, with the last verse of chapter 8. That would be verse 13. When he in this case is God, when he said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. The Greek word here for obsolete is the Greek word obsolete. That's why it's translated obsolete. But whatever is becoming obsolete is growing old and ready to disappear. Getting into verse 9, now even the first, notice he uses the word first in that last sentence, and now he's using the word first here, and that's to connect the ideas between these verses. Now the first covenant had, and what I want you to notice about had is a past tense. It's not a present tense. Had regulations of divine worship and an earthly sanctuary. And what the author of Hebrews, remember the last time I was up here, I told you the author of Hebrews is smart. He knows his audience. He's not going to say to his audience, Moses bad, Jesus good. Because if he ever said to his audience, Moses bad, he would lose them right there. He wouldn't be able to continue past that. He would have already lost them. Everybody would have already checked out and headed home. But that's not the way our author of Hebrews has been arguing. He hasn't been arguing bad, good. He's been arguing good, better. And we have to keep that in mind as we go through these. He compares things. And it's not bad, good, good, bad. It's good, better. And that's what he's about to get into. He's about to make his argument. Notice that he said that the first covenant had regulations for divine worship. Those regulations were from God. He's not saying that Moses made them up. He's not saying anything like that. He's acknowledging that as we read the first covenant there in the Pentateuch or the Torah or the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that they were given by God for divine worship. And part of that divine worship was there was an earthly sanctuary. And I don't know why, but the author is now going to reverse those two things. He's going to deal first with the tabernacle, and then he's going to deal with the divine worship. So verses 2 through 5, he deals with the earthly sanctuary, and he goes into details, verse 2, he goes into details talking about there was a tabernacle. And interesting that he uses the word tabernacle and not the word temple. What's the difference between the tabernacle and the temple? The temple was built by Solomon, and it stayed there. The tabernacle was built by Moses, and it moved everywhere the people moved. What was Moses' favorite song? They call me the wanderer. They call me the wanderer. I wander around. And that's why I don't sing. Anybody who's ever wondered why I stand up here paying attention, not singing, but paying attention, I just showed you why. Anyways, so throughout when the people are wandering in the wilderness, the tabernacle moved. Once the temple was built, the temple didn't move until it was destroyed. And that, though, stays with our theme that the author is interested in first covenant Moses, second covenant Jesus. And that's why he's going to talk about tabernacle. And he gets into so much detail here about the tabernacle. And this is where I wish we had more time and could get into all of the details here. It's so beautiful. But I like his transition there at the end of verse 5. But of these things, we can't go into detail now. And then starting in verse 6, he gets into the divine worship. One thing we have to do is we have to stay with our author. And what our author is about to do is he's about to talk about the Day of Atonement there in the Old Testament and how the people's sins were dealt with. And that's the topic that the author is focused on, because what he's about to get into is actual presence, actually entering the presence of God. Now we know in the Old Testament we have several figures that have this deep, emotional, intimate relationship with God. Moses, Elijah, David, all of these people. And there, David specifically at one point writes, the Lord was always with me. He was always at my right hand. There he's talking about relationship. He's talking about fellowship. He's not talking about what our author's talking about, and our author is talking about how to deal with sin. how to deal with sin. And that's what our author is about to get into here in verse 6. When the tabernacle was set up, when everything was prepared, the priests are continually entering the outer tabernacle to perform the divine worship. You'll remember that in the tabernacle as well as in the temple, there was the first area, the holy place. And then past the holy place was the Holy of Holies, right? And he went into all of these details, and I'm a bad person because I skipped over them. But here he's talking about every day the priests had to go into the holy place. They had duties all day, every week, and so forth. They had to replace the table of showbread with fresh bread. They had to trim the wicks on the lampstand and things like that. And his point here is that this was a continual thing. It started back with the tabernacle, and it continued, and it continued. But now, in verse 7, suddenly he changes from the outer tabernacle and he goes into the holy place. And he's talking about, but into the second place, only the high priest enters, and only once a year, and not without the taking of blood, which he offers for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. So on this special day, once a year, one person, one very specific, special person got to go into the holy place, the Holy of Holies. There we have the Ark of the Covenant, and on top of the Ark of the Covenant, the cherubim facing each other, and there we have the mercy seat. And it's there that the God of Israel would meet with that one person in dealing with sin. And here the author is talking about this, and he says something very, very interesting in verse 8. And verse 8 is very hard to translate, and it's very hard to interpret. So I want you to get out your calendars, and I want you to mark this day on your calendar, because this day, Ozzy uses the NIV, because, I know, right? Because I think the NIV words it in a way that's very easy to understand, whereas the NASB, the New American Standard Bible, words it in a way that's kind of a little bit difficult to understand. So let's get the NIV verse up here. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still standing. Now let's go over to the NASB. Same verse. The Holy Spirit was signifying by this that the way into the holy place had not yet been disclosed while the outer tabernacle, or the first tent, was still standing. Now this phrase, still standing, it could have two meanings. And the first meaning is obviously a very easy understanding. Literally, it's still there. Literally, it's still standing. But there's another meaning that could be here, and that is while it's still in operation, or while it's still the form of worship. And what he's saying is while it's still the form of worship, the way into the Holy of Holies, the way into the presence of God, has not yet been opened except to that one person, and that only once a year. And here's the hinge point of our argument, or the author's argument. Verse 9. This, that first tabernacle, still officiating, still the place, which is a symbol for the present time. And the present time would, of course, be the moment that the author of Hebrews is sitting there writing this. The present time, according to the gifts and sacrifices offered, which cannot make the worshiper perfect in conscience. I want you to write down next to this verse 14, because this is the counter verse to this verse. And the author is talking about all of these things under the first covenant, under the Sinaitic covenant, had to do with various foods and washings and drinks and so forth, that had to do with the imposing on the body until a time of reformation. So all of this Mosaic worship was good, and it was given by God, and it was given by God at Sinai, but it was limited. It was limited to one person once a year. And all of these things, they had to do with the outer, but they could not change the inner. And that's our author's point. And here, he's about to change and show why the second is better. Beginning in verse 11, "But when Christ has appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, he has gone through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made by hands, that is to say, not of this world." He's about to compare the worship system under the Mosaic system with the worship system under Christ, specifically how to deal with sin under Christ. And he's saying that Christ doesn't go into a man-made sanctuary, but instead, there on the cross, as he died, his blood being the sacrifice was giving a greater sacrifice than all those sacrifices that had come before it. All those sacrifices that needed to be repeated every day, every season, every holiday, every year. Those needed to be repeated again and again and again. But the second covenant is superior because, verse 12, "Not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood. He entered the holy place once for all." Once for all. No need of repetition. No need to do it annually. Once for all, to obtain eternal redemption. To obtain eternal redemption for those who are to worship God. And specifically here in verse 14, with all that he said up to this point, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your consciences of dead works to serve the living God? So where that old system that had to be repeated could only deal with the outside, the inside can be dealt with by this sacrifice, this once-for-all sacrifice, cleansing our consciences of sin, making us right with God through this. Now, I want to take a moment and ask you a question. How many of you, when you were young, ever heard an adult use a figure of speech? And you took that figure of speech literally? Remember? Yeah? One time, my mom made dinner, and it was a terrific dinner, and she took some for lunch the next day when she went to work. And later, she was saying that somebody was there drooling over it. And I'm this little kid, and I'm imagining somebody is literally drooling all over my mom's food. And I asked, "Did you eat it then?" The author uses what I believe we can refer to as literal metaphor. Well, what is literal metaphor? He's taking something that literally happened, but he's using metaphor to explain how it happened. The same way nobody was literally drooling over my mom's lunch so she could eat it, you know? Starting here in verse 15, I'm going to break verse 15 down into 3 parts. And I want you to be keeping notes because I'm going to, there you can see the verses that correspond with the breakdown. Verse 15, "For this reason, he," speaking of Jesus, "is the mediator of a new covenant." And the author is going to deal with that in 16 through 18. And here, there's this nice little play on words going on that the author employs. He uses in the NASB the word covenant, but in other it may be translated testament, or it may be translated will, because the word in Greek is the same word. You can have a will and testament, right? And he here in verse 16, he goes into when a will is made, it only takes effect after the person has died. While the person is still living, the will has no effect. And so he's saying that Christ becomes the mediator the second part of verse 15, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant. Go ahead and write down verses 19 through 22. Here he's going to expand on that, and he's going to get into a lot of details concerning under the first covenant. Almost everything in the tabernacle had to be purified with blood. And it talks about how when Moses had read the law to the people, he takes the blood of the calf and the blood of the bulls and water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and he sprinkles basically everything in the tabernacle, and the people cleansing them with blood. And the author of Hebrews sees in that basically everything has to be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. But here we get to what I believe is the crux of all. Here is what the author has been trying to drive home. Remember that under the first covenant, it had to be repeated week by week, year by year, annually, again and again and again. The high priest had to go in during the Day of Atonement and make the sacrifices and do this again and again and again. Here, again in verse 15, the final part, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. And here, verses 23 through 28 deal more specifically with this. But here our author reaches a climax of why the second covenant is superior to the first covenant. And that is found here starting in verse 27. Inasmuch as it has been appointed for men to die once, and after that comes judgment. Verse 28. So Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sin for many, will appear a second time for salvation, not in reference to sin, but to those who are eagerly awaiting him. Under the first covenant, under the first system, as it was repeating, the only thing that was accomplished by its repetition is that it would keep repeating. And it would keep repeating. And it would keep repeating. And that's all that would be accomplished by that first covenant. By the second covenant, he died once, and he died once for all. And the only thing now, when he comes the second time, is that promise. That promise he made for all of those who will be redeemed. That's the only thing that happens when the second happens, referring to the second covenant. He doesn't come again to die again. He doesn't have to die again. He doesn't have to be the propitiation for sin. He doesn't have to make redemption again. He's already done that. And the only thing left is that redemption, that entering into the eternal blessing, the eternal security, that thing that he promised so long ago. That's the only thing still to be fulfilled under the second covenant. And it's with that in mind that I want to ask you, which is better? A system that has to repeat again and again and again and again and again and again? Or a system where sin was dealt with once for all, and all that you wait for now is the realization of that promise? And this morning, that is the same thing that's available to everybody. That is the thing that you can have. You can have that redemption from these dead works that he was talking about earlier. You can have that. Not a system where I have to get myself right. I have to be good, and I have to do these things to be good. But a system where Christ has already paid the way for you to have that salvation, and all you have to do is wait on him for the fulfillment of that promise.